Okay, so shading is about how a surface reacts to light. It is not just about color. Um, if we look at the image I have up at the moment, it is a blue pot. It is very shiny, and we can tell that by the specular highlight here and the reflectivity here. Okay, has some reflectivity in the middle. It is also a bumpy surface, and we can see that in the transition points between the midtone, the highlight area, and the reflected area over here, and this area here, the between the specular highlight and the other areas of the midtone or the reflected. So it is very technical. It's a different way of thinking about things. And then you have these debates. You know, what is the specular? What's the midtone? I mean, this is very much the very reflective, right? That's obviously the sky. There we're getting into the blue of the sky reflected in the pot. This down here is definitely the blue color of the material. Um, and yeah, so it's very tricky. It takes a lot of work. It's a different way of thinking to approach these things. Let's go look at Maya for a moment and then talk a bit more about some theory, and then we'll go back into Maya. So, all right, so I'm going to start off with the blend here and bring it up in the attribute editor. Okay, so we have our basic properties here. Obviously, we have color. That's pretty straightforward. We have you have your hue, all right, which is what color, how intense that blue is, or how much white. Okay, and then you have your value, which is how much darkness. Okay, so those are the three independent features. That's pretty straightforward. Transparency goes up to white, and it's the transparency value. It can get a little tricky. The ambient color is something that you want to be very careful with, okay? Because what it is it's the ambient light that's bouncing around a room, okay? Or if you're outside, it's the light that's bouncing around through the environment, let's say on an overcast day, where you don't have the direct light of the sun because of the cloud cover, and so everything's sort of evenly illuminated because of ambient light. It can really screw up your lighting models, okay? So it can screw up how the surface looks if you use too much of it. Incandescence is an internal glow from heat, and we also do it for fluorescence and things. Internal glows not caused by heat because, well, we're faking things. The bump map we'll get to, and that's the showing the bumpiness of the surface without having to model all that detail. The diffuse is how much of this light is reflected, how much of the blue, all right, is reflected. The light hits the surface, picks up the blue, and then how much bounces back towards the camera and the viewer. That's the diffuse property. Okay. Translucency is the amount of light that permeates through the surface. Okay, so that's things like the skin of an orange, the skin of your fingers when you put a flashlight up against it and you see red of your blood inside your fingers, and paper. The fact that you can put a piece of paper on a window and see what's written on the other side because the light comes through. It's not transparent, but light comes through it. So that's what translucency is. Okay, and so we have a few features there, the depth and the focus. And then the main thing I wanted to talk about today is the specular shading. Okay, I mainly use blends just because I have two controls here, unlike the Phong where you have one. So that's why this is my preference. And as you see, as I change the eccentricity, it changes the size of that specular highlight. Okay? And if we do the specular roll-off, all right, that also changes the relationship at the edges of that of the specular highlight. Okay, so all right. Now the thing is, a very small one, I can make that really intense. I can even type a 2 in there. Okay, so that gives me a really intense dot, and I have a tiny number. Remember, a tiny number and the number 0 are very different. Having nothing of something is very different than having a very small amount of it. Okay, so let's put that back into the normal range. So we have the specular color, which is also as a multiplier, and we have the reflectivity, which is how reflective this is, and then the reflected color, where something is reflected. What is reflected. Okay, so the reflectivity is how much is getting reflected on that part of the surface, the power of that reflectivity, and then the reflected color is what's going to get reflected in. Okay, and so those are your basic properties here, and the different softwares have slightly different ways of dealing with them. Now if we minimize this, so if we use that vocab, all right, and look at this, okay, so that edge there is sort of the tree line, all right, from when I took the photo. All right, so this is, so that would sort of be what is reflected, all right. And the fact that this is definitely the blue sky up here, that is what is reflected. The little flecks of dirt that we're seeing up through here, they're not reflective at all. So they're going to be flat and not be reflective. All right, so that's part of it. Okay, so we have, you're seeing here, the features that you're going to be playing with the eccentricity and the specular roll-off. So you need to adjust the eccentricity and specular roll-off features to mimic this and get it accurate. All right, and yeah, so it's very tricky and it takes a lot of work and a lot of analysis to get that just right. But that way, as this specular highlight moves across the surface will come alive and feel like that material that it is, which is a painted pot. Okay, so the specular color here is white. It's usually white on most things except certain types of metals. All right, where it will go to, if you're doing a gold or something, it's going to have a gold specular highlight. Yeah. All right. So that's some of those basic terms. Let's look at a few things here. So this is a video I did for a similar course several years ago. And so I just grabbed various things, and as you see, as I'm turning this, the specular highlight behaves differently on the painted gold, right? And on the printed material versus the glazed cup. Okay, so here this is one of those special covers, and you can see a little weird sheen. All right, so it's an iridescence is the technical term for it in there, and it's coming up a little bit in the video. Not fantastic. This is an anisotropic specular highlight. All right, and so this I can't do it with a blend. I'd have to use an anisotropic, and note that there's a thumbprint there which screws up the specular highlight. Here's a camera lens. All right, and so we have tight specular highlights in some sections of it, and in other sections it's a much broader specular highlight. An old phone, so it tells you how long ago I made this. And the different plastics have different reflective properties. Okay, so how reflective they are, they have different types of plastics for the buttons. Altoids can. So the different materials here that are used in the printing, you have the gold, which has that little bit of yellow in the specular highlight I was just talking about. Yep, there you go. And slight difference in the black. Okay, but these are these subtle things, you know. But what we have to prep our textures so that as light moves across them, you get the correct size of highlight and properties of it. Okay, so if it breaks up a little bit, that is shown. So also note on the corners of the cube there, you see the little specular highlight on the rounded edge. So that's one of the reasons I'm showing this to you. So yeah, you're seeing the broad specular highlight flash across it as it turns, but that edge, you need that edge to catch the light. Okay, so that's that guy. And all right, so bashing through a couple images here. So here is a concrete floor. And as you see where the light's hitting it, it has a distinctive sheen, and then from what we'd put in as a bump map, we are seeing the breakup of that surface and the breakup of the specular highlight. And we're seeing where the builder has been working and the patterns left. Okay, so if in these areas we're not seeing those patterns, and it's just a straight gray because it's just gray. This is not this line here is not a color change. It is a small micro bump map change, or maybe or in addition, a combination of a specular highlight change. Okay, so that's where this analysis gets incredibly tricky. Okay, and so here's the plastic getting put down before the concrete. And so you can see the plastic. It has a very tight specular highlight, and it reveals the waviness of the plastic. Okay. So here's one through the windshield of the car. And as you can see, the wetness on the road is causing this glare, which makes it very difficult to see oncoming traffic. All right, so I'm looking at the sun, and right below the sun is this broad specular highlight. And as you see, it fades out in this pattern because of the cement. Where if we look on the hood here, it has a very different property to the specular highlight, or the piece of chrome here. All right, and there you're seeing reflection. Okay, and we're not seeing the color of the car. All right, we're seeing mainly reflection here, and as we're seeing probably some color in there because it's a dark car, and then as we get up, as the hood rolls away from us, it gets more and more mirror-like to in here where you can't distinguish where the car ends and where the road begins. Okay, so another one illustrating basically the same stuff. All right, so now this is a piece of an engine. As you can see, here are those anisotropic highlights. All right, And so we're getting a little specular highlight there. Not seeing too much on the gold. I guess that would be a brass material or something in there. So here we go. A little specular highlight on some water or some oil there. All right, and you can see where the pattern on the heads of the cylinders here. All right, and some of the damage. All right, and so, but it's that, as you notice, there's distinctive patterns revealed by their specular highlights. That's where we're seeing that texture. The texture is getting revealed to us in that specular highlight. That's the one we were looking at before. You know, computer equipment. As you see, there is a tight, but then it fades off sort of softly there. Specular highlight, not anything too intense on the broad plastic. And then, you know, down here we have a very tight one on the plastic here. All right, rim of a wheel. As you see, this is showing us really that nice detail of an anisotropic highlight. Okay, so you can sort of see what builds up that anisotropic highlight is these little grooves, okay, in the metal surface. Let's see. Now this is the hair of a dog, so as you can see, we have those tiny little hair highlights, and so yes, each hair probably could be done with a blend, but since we're usually doing the whole dog, or animal short hair, then an anisotropic highlight where we get those little tiny highlights that line up is the way to go for something like that. So, okay, so there you see the patterns. All right. So on this building, you see how the specular highlights are being used as part of the building design, so that as the light moves, or as you move in relation to the building, this is going to change its color and its patterns because of the different the contrasting materials here. Okay, so here, as we can see, we have the green of the car. We have over here absolute pure reflection. It is super hyper reflection. We're not seeing that that's a green surface. We're getting a beautiful yellow. We're getting some nice whites in there. You know, there's no green getting picked up in there at all. All right. We're also getting these little guys here. These are called caustics. More on those at another time. Okay. So those are the light, excess light bouncing off of here, causing these refractive patterns called caustics. So here's a piece of metal, and as you can see on it, it's basically a big specular highlight. We're getting a big broad specular highlight, but what's screwing it up is, yes, the fingerprints and the dirt from when this was washed. So someone's washed this but didn't rinse it, so the dirt has dried on it in these distinctive patterns that are then revealing it to us the history of this particular object. So this is mainly reflection. As you can see, there's some sort of scarring, something, some sort of dirt or a scratch or something across there. And we're seeing this is probably, I guess you'd do this with a blend. Mainly a lot of bump map. I mean, you could model it. And so here's a wonderful brushed aluminum with this engine turning that looks so nice. And so the specular highlights changing based off these circular grooves as its relationship to the light changes. And as we get out to here, we're getting to full total reflectivity. And that's just a slightly different exposure. All right, so that's a bit of the theory and what you want to be looking for. And then it's a question of, do you set up the patterns for the specular highlight in the specular color? Do you do it with the bump map? Do you model it? How much of it gets modeled in there? And so there's various techniques for this. But this is where a lot of the work comes in making something look really good, is to analyze this all correctly. Let's just toss that shader on there. Okay, so actually, I think I have a camera set up. Okay, there we go, and oops. We'll play around for a moment or so, and oops, no lights in the scene. Okay, so I have my light rig in here, so I'll just crank up some lights. So shading you do with an approximation of what you're going to use for the lights in your scene. Okay, and there we go. All right. So as you see, I have an area light in there, which is giving me that square specular highlight. Okay. Now, yeah, the specular highlight can get, and reflectivity are interrelated, and the settings you have in one definitely reflects the other. So, that blue pot that we're just looking at, let's get a little bit of fill light in here before we go too much further. I'll try 80. So just to quickly try to maybe emulate that surface we were looking at, the blue one. All right, let's just quickly add a bit of a bump map. Okay, so typically we do texture files. I usually do a combination of texture files in Photoshop with procedural textures that I've built within Maya. So I'm going to find the volume noise. There we go. And all right, so I've just tossed that on there. And this is where it's, more screen space is definitely necessary. All right, so there, as you see, I have little specular highlights everywhere. It's very even, maybe good for that road surface with a bit more work. Not so good for what I'm trying to get here. Okay, so I'm going to just stretch this out a bit. Tuck that off the side because I can lose that part of the screen. Okay. Sort of balancing stuff. All right, so I'm going to go into the bump depth because that pot we're looking at had a very small amount of bump. So now I'll render it, and still lots of these little guys everywhere. Now, because I've practiced a lot with this, I know I usually like to start off with 0.5 in my amplitude whenever I'm using the volume noise. Okay, so that should help a little bit. That's getting sort of towards what I was looking for the orange. So I make a mental note of that. I might come back to that later. All right, so, and I've just scaled up the shader a bit. There we go. So I use the fit to group bounding box, but you can just do a normal scale there. Okay, and so there, as you see, we're starting to get that pattern similar to our reference. Okay, as I slowly drift off topic here. Okay, so there I got my blue. I got roughly this pattern. Okay, probably good enough for our little conversation here. Then what I'm going to want to do is try to, let's see, I probably should get some the reflectivity sorted out. Okay, so the reflected color, I'm going to go use a 3D environmental texture. Okay, environmental sphere. And then you need to reflect the environment. So I just have a stock one that I always use. So I'm just loading in a file. Let's stretch all that out so you can see it. Okay, so there's the environmental sphere. Here is the file coming in. Okay, and then I just load in my file, which there's the BG file that I like to use. So that's sort of stretched out there. Okay, so the file goes into the environmental sphere. The place 3D texture node to the environmental sphere here controls where the center of that world is. The place 2D texture controls where the file is on that. Okay, so I sometimes like to just double that. Okay, so it wraps all the way around a bit better. Over here I have the place 3D texture node for the volume noise. The volume noise then goes into the bump. The bump goes into the blend and into the environmental sphere. So let's take a quick look at that. So there we can see the reflected sky and everything coming in above that. All right, so that's pretty good. Considering this is not exactly what I'd planned to lecture this lecture with. All right, so I can make it a highly reflective surface if I want, or I can take it down. I can click on the map button. I'm going to go to Utilities, and there's the Studio Clear Coat, which I probably should use. And I am going to use the stock. All right, I have to load it from a plugin. This is why I like doing these this style demo, because these are the sorts of issues that you run into. So let's get the freckles loaded up. That could be useful. So these are the sorts of things you run into as you're working. And ringness. Sun streaks, splatter. There it is, the clear coat. Okay, close. All right, so I've loaded in the clear coat and a few other things. So they just pop up in there. So if we look at the 2D, you can see there's the freckles. So always handy to have that kicking around. Alrighty, and so we just zip down here to Utilities, and I grab the clear coat. Okay, yeah. They changed the name on that. That used to be Studio Clear Coat. Alright, so now I will drop that in with the middle mouse button into reflection, and there we go. And so now that's giving me that more intensive reflection on the outside. So with those guys in place, I can finally start really tuning my specular highlight. I don't know if it'll let me keep the reference up there. Okay, so just do a little box there. And so if I broaden that out, And all right, soften that. Okay. All right, that's fairly tight. And okay, yeah, there we go. We're getting somewhere. All right. So you have to do this with every single surface. Yeah, it's not great at the moment, but you get the idea. Okay, and it's modifying all the different properties to build up that particular look of that surface that you're trying to replicate, and analyzing it and looking for how it reacts to light, what are its properties. You know, I'm now thinking maybe the bump map needs to be a bit smaller. Okay, and so you've seen a bit about how I approach things procedurally here, but you can also do all of this in Photoshop. So that's, and you can build out these patterns and things in Photoshop, or you can also export these textures as well. So I'm just going to select the Place 3D Texture node here. I'm going to shrink that a little bit. And so I'm just going to render a little region there. Maybe I like that a bit better. All right, maybe a little bit down. Yeah, I'm sort of liking that. Gonna pop back over here to the noise. You know, then you can start playing with all these guys. You know, your frequencies and stuff. I'm gonna check the effects and see if I like the invert. So I'm gonna hit the invert button and see if I like that a bit better. Okay, so that just flops over the black areas for white and the white areas for black. All right, so that's a handy one to know about. But anyhow, so that's how you want to approach shading, is looking at how the object reacts to light, how light moves across it, and then identify what is the what's really the color, what's reflected color, what's the specular properties of the material, what are the yeah, so all these little things need to be brought together to get that surface to look real. Hope that helps. Have fun.